Good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel Cass, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's discussion with Parag Khanna, author of the new book, How to Run the World, Charting a Course to the Next Renaissance. Now I'm very pleased to introduce Parag Khanna. An international relations expert, Parag Khanna is the director of the Global Governance Initiative in the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation. He's previously worked as an analyst for the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Affairs, and the Brookings Institution, and he provided expert advice to Barack Obama during his presidential campaign. His first book, The Second World, discussed the emerging global marketplace and the impact of the first three truly global superpowers, the US, China, and the European Union. In reviews of that book, the Washington Post called him a serious scholar, and the New York Times dubbed him a foreign policy whiz kid. Mr. Khanna's new book, How to Run the World, compares today's global society and culture to that of the Middle Ages, with its Asian empires, Western military forces, Middle Eastern kingdoms, and wealthy business interests. And he'll tell you more about that. And now please join me in welcoming Parag Khanna.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening. And with today's announcement about the demise of Borders, it's particularly relevant to support your local bookstore, especially if you do come here regularly for the outstanding offerings that they have. And so it's actually humbling, obviously, to be here at Harvard and falling in between various luminaries. But I'm a little bit more comfortable because it's my second time here for my first book, which, The Second World, which made it onto the syllabus of a variety of courses here, so I feel somewhat legitimized. And my wife isn't here tonight, but she was an undergrad here, so she sends her support my way as well. Now, this is an ambitious title, and one would think that would have been written by a Harvard professor, after all. In that rotating door between Harvard and the White House, that has purported to run the world over the last decades and centuries. But I have a somewhat different purpose in mind with this title, and obviously we knew in thinking about the title for this book that it would come across in different ways to different audiences and have different meanings. But I actually really gave it this title with a straight face in a very, very literal sense, because I have thought long and hard about how we run the world and have come up with a one-word answer. And I believe there is only one legitimate one-word answer to how to run the world. And I'm wondering if any of you want to jump out and blurt it out. But that word is diplomacy. This is a book about diplomacy. And it didn't make its way into the subtitle because diplomacy doesn't seem to sell all that much when you put it in the title or subtitle of a book. But I had to sneak it in there somehow, so I thought, let's go with something very ambitious. But you can write a book about war and conquest. You could call it How to Rule the World, and that will take you so far. The operative word in this title is run. How do you run something? You run it through management, through a system, through a process, through a dialogue, through negotiation, through laws, codes, rules. How do you establish those things? You establish them through diplomacy. One simple word that is so often neglected in our foreign policy discourse. Now, it gets used a lot in theory, but in practice, it's a whole different situation. In our discourse, I think it holds a very, very narrow, minute sort of place. People think of diplomacy as just this kind of antidote to war. You put it in a box, or when war fails, I guess we have to use diplomacy. Bush administration didn't go so well in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's pull out the diplomacy. Let's start talking to people, and we'll get them to get on board with our interests. Even that proves not to be so easy. When you think of diplomacy as just an afterthought, it's not going to serve you very well. So I wanted to recover diplomacy. I didn't want it to just be in a little box, and I didn't even want it to stand alongside other options like war and conquest. I wanted to put it above everything. So I wanted to almost commit this sort of literary hyperbole in a way. But it's well justified in the literature on international relations. The scholars who have defined world political theory, international history, and so forth have talked about categories of institutions and activities like international law, like war, and others. But some of the great scholars, Hedley Bull, Martin White, and others of a tradition called the English school, they had trouble fitting diplomacy in for them. They had to, the term we use in international relations theory is coding. What do you code a practice? And they said diplomacy is the master institution. Somehow nothing else really gets done without it. And as with my background in international relations theory, I wanted to make something of that and elevate it in the way that those scholars had, and bring it back into practice. There's actually not a lot. There's obviously very little theory in this skinny book, and that too was expunged by my editors. They figured that people reading a book called How to Run the World didn't want to hear about arcane, sort of the arcana of IR theory. But I did study it, and I did take it very seriously, and this is a homage to the study of diplomatic theory and diplomatic history, but mostly in practice, much less in theory. The other mistake about diplomacy, beyond just belittling it and thinking of it as just something that is optional in world politics rather than a part and parcel of everything we do, is to think of it as something that only governments do, only states do it. Only Hillary Clinton is allowed to make a diplomatic statement, or Barack Obama. Diplomacy is what is done at the G20 summit. It's what's done at the United Nations, maybe at the World Bank or something like that. That's it. That's diplomacy. The sum total of those 200 countries in the world and their relationships, that's diplomacy. That's an even bigger mistake. Diplomacy, there's another joke from diplomatic studies. Diplomacy is the second oldest profession. I don't need to tell you what the first is, do I? The second oldest profession. So long as you have had dialogue and communication and relations among communities, you have had diplomacy. In ancient times, Babylonian era and so forth, diplomacy took place among tribes, merchants, city-states, all manner of entities that negotiated with each other over access to territory, the costs of goods, and trade routes and so forth. That was diplomacy. We didn't have states. We've only had modern states since when? Since the 17th century. What was everything prior to the 17th century? Was it not diplomacy? Well, then it couldn't be the second oldest profession if that wasn't diplomacy. So we've always had diplomacy. But for the last couple of hundred years, we've lived in a state-centric, state-dominated world, and therefore we have forgotten about diplomacy long predates the state and will long outlast it. We are moving into a post-Westphalian world. There are states, but there are also cities that operate beyond states. There are companies that operate across states. There are NGOs that are transnational actors. There are terrorist movements that have their operations and loyalties across states. There are religious groups, churches, the Catholic Church, Islam, that have global communities of belief and following that don't have much to do with the state at all. They also long predate the state. Where are they when we theorize about diplomacy? Because when we do diplomacy in the real world, we actually have this hodgepodge, this mix. If you really fast forward from these ancient periods that I'm talking about into the 21st century, they actually have more in common with each other than the world we're in, than the world that we have lived in for the last couple of hundred years. And so as we search for a way to explain patterns of relations and interaction that we're seeing every day, trying to make sense of. When we see company mercenary armies involved in toppling governments, when we see oil companies calling the shots in the policies of foreign countries, when we see the Gates Foundation basically serving as the public health arm of foreign governments overseas, when we see Walmart providing most of the employment in entire communities around the world, all of these things, how do those things happen? They happen through negotiations, through access that is transnational, and they didn't require necessarily that a government authorize it, that a government lead it, or anything of the sort. But those were diplomatic acts. They were results of diplomacy. So as we search for these models to explain a chaotic world in which we see so many players, it's so confusing, it's so complex, you hear these words all the time, you can actually look back 1,000 years to the Middle Ages and find a pretty good model for what the world looked like. And there's a couple of the two fundamental reasons why the Middle Ages is, to me, a useful analogy that I start this book with. But you see it ends optimistically with the Renaissance, so never fear. But the first is because that was a multipolar world. Today you hear this word a lot, multipolar. Rise of new powers, the BRICS, China, Russia, India, Brazil, and so forth. It's a multipolar world. America's not the only superpower. We're competing with others, right? You hear it all the time. That was a multipolar world 1,000 years ago. Song Dynasty China was the most advanced civilization of the time. It had the largest cities, had invented paper making, all sorts of things, gunpowder, and so on. The Arab Islamic caliphates were at their peak of power at that time. They ruled all the way from North Africa to Central Asia. India was the most powerful dynasty. It was the Chola dynasty of India, South Indian power. That was actually a naval force. It stretched its influence all the way to Indonesia. And today, India is, again, a major naval power. It was the West, and this is why the term Middle Ages has such dark connotations for us in the U.S. and in the Western world. It was the Dark Ages, much of it, for the West. The West was divided between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. Both were weakening and certainly defensive in many ways. It was also a time, obviously, of the plague and crusades and so forth, and thus also has negative connotations for us. But it was most certainly a multipolar world, much as the world is today. That was also a time, though, when the first intercontinental, transcontinental trading system was formed. I call it globalization 1.0. The Silk Roads, Marco Polo, and so on, the search for wealth, spices, and so forth, that led to the formation of trade on a regular basis, believe it or not, between Europe, particularly obviously the city-states of Europe, all the way to Asia, became ritualized. And so today, to me, we're in sort of globalization maybe 5.0 if you think about the major waves and cycles of history. But that was globalization 1.0. And I mentioned Italian city-states earlier, and this gets back to this multiplicity of actors that we have in the world today that we think of as being diplomatic actors, having their own agency, their own authority, calling their own shots. And those include companies, cities, NGOs, religious groups, mercenary armies, you name it, are all out there doing their own thing. That was very much the case in the multi-layered, overlapping medieval world. Nominally, the Holy Roman Empire ruled over Western Europe, but of course we know that most kings and princes only paid lip service to them and really ruled their own fiefdoms, and then of course mercenaries reigned free across the land. So that sort of that sort of feudal environment is a little bit of what some of us feel today when we think about just the anxiety, or we feel a certain anxiety about the world. So the medieval analogy to me is useful in these two contexts: the fact that it was a multipolar world and the fact that it was an overlapping world of very different kinds of powers. So that sets a baseline for what the world looks like today. So now what do we do about it? And that's where you have to bring diplomacy back in. Because the world of nation states, the world of these sovereign actors and their organizations, whether it's the UN or the World Bank or the G20, have really had their chance. They have been running the world, have they not? Has it worked? Well, let's see. I think the term perfect storm really captures a lot of what we feel we face in the world today. A financial crisis can trigger food crises and oil price spikes, and we have climate change and natural disasters, and we almost feel overwhelmed by the ways in which one crisis can sort of trigger another. What is the response of the governments of the world through their institutions? When the G20 gets together, is it really able to, does it raise your confidence in the ability of intergovernmental entities to operate outside of these narrow silos, World Health Organization, UN Environment Program, and so on and so on, to really address these things? Not really, right? Who expected the Copenhagen or Cancun climate summits to yield a legally binding, universally accepted reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020? No, I think not. And so we have slowly, gradually begun to lose faith and confidence in the ability of centralized international organizations, or even the U.S. as a superpower and global cop, to address all of these crises around the world. It's not going to happen. We are never going to either have the will or the resources, or the consensus, the desire, the ability to do it. And the other powers in the world, Europe, largely internally absorbed at the moment, China very opportunistic, and so forth. So that, though the resources are not going to be present in just the state system alone to deal with these things. And yet, to me, the fact that diplomacy is so confusing, all these actors are out there, to me they represent resources, untapped, unharnessed, uncoordinated, inefficient. And so what I try to advocate in this book is a system that I call mega diplomacy. And I had to call it mega diplomacy because for so many people, again, diplomacy is just what governments do. So you have to add a prefix to connote that you really believe that everyone can be a participant, that you can form new coalitions among public and private actors, and you can then do a better job of addressing some of these problems. And in some ways, with some audiences, particularly in the more conservative scholarly community, you feel like you're fighting an uphill battle because they live in a theoretical world rather than the real world. When I look at the real world, I already see mega diplomacy being the norm, and that's why one can actually ultimately be optimistic. My sort of conclusion in some ways in the book is that we're actually doing this, we just need to do it better and more efficiently, and that technology and knowledge sharing and communication is starting to get us into a position where we'll do a better job of this. But what I try and do is present example after example after example, painstakingly, I think, of every single problem you can think of on the global agenda. You want to promote good governance, you want to tackle climate change, you want to deal with poverty, you want to rebuild failed states, you name it. And you name the place where it's happening, and I'll give you an example of how the solution or the best practice that is currently underway has very little to do with a rigid world of interstate diplomacy and a lot to do with people, with individuals, with all kinds of communities pitching in, lending a hand, forming coalitions, and so forth. So actually one of the punchlines of the book is everyone is a diplomat. Rather than a world in which there's a very limited number of diplomats, only those who represent their government. There's .org diplomats, .com diplomats, .edu diplomats, and I say .god diplomats as well, because religious actors, again, play such an important role. And that mega diplomacy is actually alive and well and thriving. And if you think about, let's take a few examples. I mean, 10 years of a largely militarized policy in Afghanistan, how much success do we have? How much state building has taken place? How stable is the country? Not really yet. So what has the Pentagon decided to do? They created an Office of Business and Stabilization Operations. So now you have commanders in the field recruiting CEOs and people from American companies to go to Afghanistan saying, would you mind building a factory here? Could you connect this village to, can you build a road about employing some people here? Because Afghanistan is not going to stand on its own 2 feet with just our military calling shots. We now have to bring in companies. Who's built the majority of the schools and health clinics in that country? Those that exist, and there's quite a few. It's actually not as dismal on the social development side as people think. Oxfam, CARE, Save the Children, and so forth. How long would it have taken for a sovereign, competent Afghan Ministry of Education to deliver that without the obscene levels of corruption that permeate that system? A very, very, very long time, perhaps never. So it's happening a lot faster as a result of bringing in these new actors, and the funding they get comes from different sources. This isn't either or. It's not either governments or NGOs, right? A lot of the NGOs get their money from USAID. USAID doesn't have the technical capacity, the manpower, even the competence to do some of these things, and it does it at a huge cost and often sinking the money back into the pockets of Beltway bandits and other contractors. Instead, if you give the money to NGOs, they are demonstrably more efficient, less expensive, and more effective in the long run, and do a much better job of training locals. So that's just one thing. You want to rebuild Afghanistan, you can't do it without mega diplomacy. You can't do it with just the military alone. No way. And that's a hard security issue. Let's say you want to fight terrorism. Let's go drain the swamps, right? Like whether you're George Bush or Condi Rice. I hope we don't use that term anymore in this administration. But yeah, hard power, done. It's done a tremendous amount, hasn't it? Has it really reduced global terrorism? I mean, not exactly. I think there is some consensus, although this may sound very soft to a lot of people, but that education and job creation, employment, these are pretty important things when it comes to combating terrorism. You want to create alternatives. This is very logical. You don't need to be a social scientist or a psychologist to understand this. If you're a young Egyptian today, do you go to a place, institution of prayer, a mosque somewhere where you might get radicalized, or do you go to a school or to a soccer field or to a social club or have a job or something like that? If you had those alternatives, you would have choices as to how you spend your time and what you do with it. So I'm going to I'm going to assume that you agree that education and job creation are valid strategies for combating terrorism in the Middle East and elsewhere. Well, I want you to name the U.S. government agency, or I want you to tell me how the State Department does that. Right, they don't. They don't do it. They don't do it at all. So in the midst of the last decade, where America's reputation in the Middle East has obviously been at an all-time low, what one radical thing happened in the Middle East that was driven by Western actors or entities? You're sitting in one of the places that's doing it. Our universities, American universities, dozens of them have opened up campuses in Doha, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, God knows where, all over the place. PhDs from here now get paid by the Saudi government to teach at KAUST, which is the new University of Science, Technology, Engineering in Saudi Arabia. Lots and lots and lots of American campuses. But I thought they hated us, right? Isn't that what you were told? Cover of all these magazines? Not at all. They don't like U.S. policy, but certainly American institutions of higher learning that are the finest in the world are very welcome any day of the week. They'd be very happy to have them, and they do have them now. And in the last 6 or 7 years that they've been there, they've already been some research showing that it's really had an impact on local values, women's rights, and things like that, more people getting educated and so on. It's really impressive. So I think the finest thing that our foreign policy has done in the Middle East has not been done by the U.S. government. It's been done by our universities. It happened despite government policy. Because why did this happen in the first place? Because after 9/11, we didn't give visas to qualified Arabs and others who wanted to come to the United States. You should all be familiar with this phenomenon because you probably may know someone whose visa was denied, who had a place at Harvard or somewhere else and wasn't able to come. So now they get to go to an American university campus in Doha or somewhere else, and I think that's a phenomenal achievement, and it's generated a tremendous amount of goodwill. It's a story I write about in this book. And another is, again, creating jobs. Who's going to create jobs? We're having a lot of trouble creating jobs here, aren't we? Last time I checked. But we can also do the same overseas. American companies actually have a lot of influence and are still largely welcome around the world because they do create jobs, they do pay higher wages. Yes, there's scandals around Nike and all sorts of things. Leave it, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Our foreign investment overseas is second only in aggregate to the total European Union, and we create hundreds of thousands of jobs all over the world, particularly in or very much in places like Egypt and so forth. And we can do a lot more of that. But in order to get the companies to go there, our government has realized, you have to partner. So a couple of interesting things are underway. The State Department now doesn't just go and fly to Egypt or Yemen or wherever and say, we'd really appreciate if you respect human rights and gradually move towards democracy, and then pack up and leave. Words mean nothing. The diplomacy of words is giving way to the diplomacy of deeds. Now when American officials fly out there, they fly with CEOs of companies, people who are in the manufacturing sector, and they take them around, they tour around, they say, where can you build a factory, where can you create some jobs, how can you employ people, and things like this. And that's starting to gain some traction, and I think that's very impressive. Another thing that our government can do, and is starting to do, is to increase risk insurance guarantees. Now this may sound like a very technical thing, but it's also rather obvious. Companies that are going to take risks in unstable emerging markets need some incentive, and so our government can provide those risk guarantees so they go and do it. And that's not just in the Middle East, it's all over Africa. What is one move that has created such goodwill in Africa? It's actually the passage of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which increased the volume of exports from African countries into the United States, but also reduced some restrictions on American investment into African countries. So more American companies are going there, and it's building a lot of goodwill. It's because we did something. We didn't just talk about it, we did it. And very often the diplomacy of doing, the diplomacy of the deed, the diplomacy that I champion wholeheartedly in this book is not just done by governments and by bureaucrats. It's done by NGOs, and it's done by companies, which is why I really wanted to accord them a role in diplomacy. And so to me, anyone in this room can be a diplomat. To me, if you work for the Gates Foundation, you're a health diplomat. You're delivering public health. You would negotiate that access. If you work for the Clinton Foundation and you're negotiating with a pharmaceutical company to reduce the cost of vaccines, and then negotiating with companies to then deliver it at a low cost to clinics in various African countries, that is a very complex act and process of diplomacy going on there. if you work for Amnesty International, you are most certainly a human rights diplomat. Try pushing for human rights in the Human Rights Council of the UN when Libya is the chair. You're not going to get very far, right? And not to mention that the United Nations system is premised on state sovereignty, so non-interference plays a big role. How do you wag your finger at China over Tibet when China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council? You don't really get very far. You find that American pressure for human rights in China has drastically diminished, along with America's leverage over China. So who's going to do it? So I profile in this book a couple of NGOs who actually have been welcomed in by the Chinese government because they are non-intrusive politically at the top level, but actually do a lot to train judges and heads of prisons to promote respect for prisoners, habeas corpus rights, things like this in China, Cambodia, and all over the place. So our NGOs can actually go in and play an important technical role in actually improving human rights. I also talk about Walmart. I mean, what company is more hated in America, right? Because they open up next door and shut down all the local, the equivalent of local bookstores, local retailers around the country. There's no company that's more loved around the world than Walmart. I don't know how many of you to whom that might be shocking news. But Walmart creates jobs. Walmart hires women. Walmart pays people. Walmart connects places in the middle of nowhere to a global supply chain. And so it's actually very welcome in countries around Africa where they're starting to open up for very obvious reasons. That's an American company, one of our biggest companies. And it does more to promote America's sort of image and standing in the world than we do. And it does it as a company. It doesn't cost you anything as such. So there's so many examples really of this sort of private sector leadership, NGO leadership. It's not always alone. Again, so much of it is done in partnership with governments behind the scenes. When the Rockefeller Foundation underwrites the development of high-yield seeds to distribute to West African farmers, often the U.S. government, USAID, is involved in underwriting some of that and spreading and funding the distribution. Our embassies are involved. None of this is either or, but it's to say that we're moving into a much more complex era where we need to think about these partnerships in a world of limited government resources, but enormous resources and opportunities and desire and will among all of these other players. We should be embracing these coalitions rather than living in rigid diplomatic kinds of silos. To me, this is a message that I think the Generation Y, letter Y, gets very intuitively. I find that when I talk to students all over the world, they no longer think of, they want careers in service, not necessarily public service. The word public has almost fallen out. They just want to do something good. And they feel that if they do it by working for Oxfam or by going and teaching English abroad or by donating through Kiva to startup companies in Uganda, whatever it is, there is a sense that they can do some good leveraging the technologies of globalization and so forth. And they can feel like they're involved in service. And the old model of public service, meaning you had to go work for the government for a meager salary and go through all kinds of testing and boring sorts of procedures. I'm someone who took the U.S. Foreign Service exam and passed and then bailed out when I saw what a sort of siloed and defunct, really, and irrelevant process it was to the real world. And so I could have gone the route of that traditional sort of, foreign service officer, and yet I feel that I've been much better off and perhaps had more influence being an outsider and getting involved in that way. And I see so many examples of that today. And again, Generation Y, the younger generation, really intuitively grasps this, which is one of the reasons why I'm very hopeful. This is probably the only book in this store that has a chapter titled The Geopolitics of Generation Y. And this was obviously written prior to what's been happening in Egypt. And no doubt we've all been paying close attention to that and seeing the leadership of Generation Y. And I take that very seriously because I've spent a lot of time in Egypt. And it was probably in Egypt where I first started thinking about, writing about the geopolitical role this generation could have because of connectedness and so forth. So to me, I hope that in the course of this generation's rise into the ranks of power across all sectors of society, that we will not have to wait hundreds of years to get from the last Middle Ages to the Renaissance that it took then, but maybe just one generation to get from our new Middle Ages to the next Renaissance. Thank you very much. Diplomacy is a negotiation among authorities, not among states. Diplomacy predates the state, therefore it predates state sovereignty. So an authority can come in many forms. An authority can again be a church, a religious authority, an educational authority, a financial authority such as a company. The House of Medici and the various merchant houses of Bruges in the Middle Ages that financed the great voyages that created this first wave of globalization. They were engaged in negotiations with territorial actors and empires and so forth. They were certainly engaged in diplomacy. So from strictly definitionally speaking, the definition of diplomacy, other than those definitions that seek to centralize diplomacy among states and you said classical, I would use the word traditional diplomacy, being only the state-centric variety. I'm afraid, to me, that's only one slice of diplomacy, both historically, empirically, and theoretically. So definitionally, I fundamentally disagree, and that's a major premise of this argument. The other is your assertion that states provide the framework and everyone else is just sort of a hanger-on to that, right? Because that reflects a belief that states, and that there is, first of all, there's one kind of state, and that all states are somehow equal fundamentally in terms of their legal status, their capacity, their respectability, and so forth. No such thing is true in this world. There are 200-some states in the world, and not all of them are coherent, sovereign, competent entities that we should even respect or treat in a way as legally equal. And in fact, we don't. If it weren't for states that are so abusive of their populations and so heinously corrupt in conducting genocide, we wouldn't have something called the responsibility to protect doctrine, which makes it a legal obligation for the international community to invade and intervene in states that are so unstate-like in their behavior, or so unrespectable in their behavior. So to me, with much of the post-colonial world, which is more than half the world's states, in some way, shape, or form in a state of disrepair, I simply can't agree to treat all states equally. In states where the majority of public services are provided by some combination of international donor agencies, NGOs, and corporations, and other types of philanthropic and charitable entities, I can't really see those entities as just being cute add-ons to the system, to the structure. The World Health Organization is an international agency that is funded by, that serves the governments of the world, and yet 30 to 35% of its annual operating budget comes from the Gates Foundation, which is an NGO. So just so it's clear, an NGO provides the budget for an international organization. In at least 30 to 35 of the LDCs, the least developed countries I mentioned earlier, humanitarian assistance, all of these, again, basic, fundamental public services, even law and order, are provided by a variety of private actors. And the state, as you're referring to it, is really the government, which is one actor in that hodgepodge, and often an abusive and a corrupt one that's really out for its own interests, a rent-seeking, exploitative entity. So I don't really see in reality what the map of the world looks like on paper and what the map of international institutional architecture is on paper. So when you say G20, for example, a lot of people have great faith in the G20. And no doubt its governments that are part of it do represent 20 nations. They represent 80% of the world's population. Almost 80% of the world's economy. But in reality, does the creation of this entity that has a summit in Pittsburgh and in London and elsewhere, does that really regulate the world? They can't even agree on banking supervision. They can't agree on salaries for CEOs. Are you going to put climate change in their lap, Middle East peace, the Iranian nuclear program? That state architecture isn't working either. The fact that Argentina is a member of the G20 doesn't really give me great confidence that all of a sudden the state system is somehow central and everyone else is a hanger-on. To me, power and diplomacy and solutions are contextual. They're situational. They're functional. If you want to solve an environmental problem, you can pretend that there is a state architecture, because we just had a summit, right, at Cancun and Copenhagen and Bali and Kyoto decades ago. We can have 50 summits for the next 50 years on climate change. I won't put any faith in it whatsoever, and that is the state way of dealing with it. I'll put my faith, though, in clean tech companies and in the innovation they provide, and I will hope that governments will subsidize that innovation and transfer that technology to industrializing countries to reduce their emissions. I believe if we do that, and that's mega diplomacy at work, it would happen. You would deal with climate change a hell of a lot faster than through the state system. So I think it depends issue by issue. Obviously, there are issues of war and peace, great power issues, where of course, the UN Security Council is a central institution. No doubt that's one of the entities you're referring to, and I obviously agree that in certain issues, the arbitration of international law in that sense does hinge on certain states, but not on all of them all of the time, just on some of them some of the time. For everything else, we're very much scrambling. We're very reactive. We're in crisis mode, and I don't see that state architecture getting on its feet again at a time when it seems to be weakening more than ever. But I think Walter was also alluding to other agencies of the U.S. government who have enormous budgets. The Department of Energy, for example, has its own relationships on issues of nuclear power, energy management, and sustainability, and so forth with many countries around the world. The Department of Defense has its own defense sort of driven diplomacy. Our military has relations with most foreign militaries in the world. They are conducting military to military diplomacy in some sense. So I think Walter is implying that even from one country, and not just any one country, but particularly this country, there is such a profusion, a substantial volume of diplomacy going on, and to think of the State Department alone as encapsulating that is a great myth, obviously. And there is a joke about, it's not a joke, the number of Foreign Service officers, which is 6,500, all fit on the deck of one aircraft carrier. And that kind of puts into perspective how few diplomats we actually really have out there in the world. So I certainly agree with that. Soft power is a relatively recent coinage, and it also, it has more of polemical value than sort of analytic value, because it's very hard to, put on this spectrum. Military power is here, and it's hard power, and everything else is soft power. That's not really how the world works. The military is very often involved in compellence and persuasion, and yet Joe and I define soft power as being about persuasion, and yet the military also does a lot of persuasion. So I think the lines are very blurry. So I don't really use that term, actually. I think the remarks I made and the positive things I described speak to the potential of the private sector to make a systemic difference in a lot of places. So if you are a poor African country that has oil and you don't have the technical capacity to extract it, you're going to need Exxon or Shell or Chevron or whomever to do it, right? And without that, you will never have wealth, simply never. Right, and that would be too bad. So the role of those companies, as perverse as some of the consequences and implications of their presence may be, and I have a long section here about Royal Dutch Shell's experience in Nigeria and what it reveals about the good, the bad, and the ugly of corporate power internationally. So I'm certainly not unaware of this. I've witnessed it myself everywhere. But what I talk about in mega diplomacy is the concept of accountability. Whereas there has been very little accountability in the past for some of these corporations and their roles abroad, you can have systems of accountability. Those systems of accountability are, if they're not coming from the U.S. government, who doesn't seem to monitor or watch what its companies are doing abroad, or certainly not sanction them for it, and if the host governments are actually too weak to do anything about it, and after all they're being bribed by the oil companies, right? How are you going to create a system of accountability? So I spend a lot of time in this profiling what's called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And one of the main backers of that is Harvard professor John Ruggie, who teaches at the Kennedy School, who's the UN Special Advisor on Business and Human Rights in zones of conflict and more broadly. And the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative is a perfect example of what I'm calling mega diplomacy, because the oil companies, to be involved, to sort of be permitted without international sanction to operate in a certain country, they have to publish and disclose what they're paying in terms of access rights and so forth for resources of the government. That creates a level playing field across the companies that are bidding for contracts in those companies, so the companies actually want it. Then the World Bank is involved because a certain share of the profits from oil extraction have to go into an escrow account. But then to spend that money, the host government, which is obviously obscenely corrupt in almost all cases, has to actually consult with a committee of civil society people, including women and educators and so forth. And the money has to go into schools, hospitals, roads, economic diversification, and things like this. It's all extremely complicated stuff, isn't it? But that's the only way you'll ever have accountability over these nefarious, hideous, repayments rapacious companies that you're talking about. And rightly so, they have behaved that way. The only way to monitor it, regulate it, create accountability around it is through a scheme such as I'm describing, which involves the World Bank, it involves NGOs, it involves the local government, it involves the oil companies, involves a little bit of everyone, and everyone's watching everyone because no one should trust anyone else, quite frankly, because everyone has blood on their hands in one way, shape, or form, or has had it. And this is the only way, and it's actually working in some cases. And your alternative is either let the pillage continue, unmonitored, or to leave the resources in the ground. That doesn't really help anyone. So that's to take just one example, but it is a really big example. I mean, we have talked for years about the resource curse. This is a term that everyone here is familiar with, the resource curse. The resource curse says, God forbid a country would discover oil. That means in 5 years there's going to be a civil war and a coup and negative growth rates because they will have blown it, because country after country has blown it. You know, here I'm pointing to a real life example of changing that, of undoing or preventing the resource curse. And it takes a lot of different actors to make it work, but it's worth the effort. There is a functional understanding that I'm projecting, yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean specialization, but certainly, you know, functional expertise is an important factor, certainly in diplomacy and in acting in it. I mean, part of the reason why this diffusion of diplomacy began to happen is because of climate change negotiations. What are you going to do getting a bunch of guys trained in philosophy who became diplomats negotiating climate change? What scientific knowledge did they have in the 60s, 70s, and so on when this started? They had to bring in outside technical experts. The same thing now goes for agriculture, for everything you can imagine. Scientific knowledge is a big factor in the reason why diplomacy started to rise, because we have developed more of a science about governance and so forth, or how to solve certain problems through technical competence, and governments just have not had that. So that's one reason. It doesn't mean, though, that just because you're the agriculture person, you know, and someone else is you know, the freshwater person and so forth, that you have nothing to do with each other. You know, I mean, what we find very often is that these issues are quite interrelated. So a place where there is a conflict brewing is also a place where disease is likely to spread, is also a place where education enrollment is going to go down, and all sorts of other bad things are going to happen. So these things move together, upwards and downwards, these issues. And you find that you kind of have to get the different functional experts together to come up with systems kinds of answers to what to do about it, but in specific places. Because a lot of people say the world is starting to look like the 19th century, a multipolar world, right? The European 19th century was multipolar. The problem is that was a European world. This is a global world. There are more than just European powers populating the world stage. So in that sense, you know, the 19th century is not to me a very good analogy. The other analogy that people make is the interwar years, you know, in that sort of somewhat chaotic period after the demise of the League of Nations, rise of Germany, and so forth. And neither of those ended well, right? The former ended in World War I, the latter ended in World War II. If you make an analogy towards the Middle Ages culminating in the Renaissance, you're saying that we don't have to go through these cycles, these geopolitical cycles of war among superpowers and rising powers. That was a topic that my last book addressed in depth, which is, you know, are geopolitical cycles as we've known them for centuries going to just continue as such? One damn thing after another, one war, one cataclysmic war every 100 years. Many people think of World War I and World War II, as you know, as being one sort of, you know, conflict period. And the next one is due, you know, 2020, you know, or something like that, because that is the way a lot of international relations scholars think. And it's hard not to be tempted by that, of course, with rising China and friction with them. We can't agree on anything, right? It's kind of, you know, a lot of people kind of take it for granted that they're World War III, US and China, who else? Right? I mean, it's almost become a foregone conclusion. So these are multiple reasons why, if you take this approach, you can wind up in a different direction. And I imagine many of us would join me in hoping that we do. Struggling societies are, and particularly the non-governmental sectors of society in countries that are developing and emerging markets, they don't really believe that their governments are ever going to stand up and fix all the problems and become, you know, competent Western-style democracies or whatever the case may be. So they look ever more towards these public-private models. I mean, India is a really good example, and I have a section in this book about the India model. What I say is, you know, everyone talks about the China model. It's great to talk about the China model because China's a disciplined country, getting things done. Maybe it breaks a lot of eggs to make its omelet, but you know, high growth rates, high literacy, all these things. But unfortunately, to emulate the China model requires discipline. And no other country really seems to have any discipline these days. Arab autocrats have been talking about the China model for years. I wrote about it in my last book. They were all like, yes, the China model, because, you know, the economic growth, and eventually we'll get to political reform. Of course, they never really meant it, right? Nor did they deliver anything to the people the way China has. The India model is much more bottom-up, haphazard, chaotic. It involves industrialist families. It involves corporate unions. It involves diasporas. It involves all sorts of players, NGOs, getting in the mix and formulating, sort of better policies to improve Indian governance and so forth. So to me, for much of the post-colonial world, for much of Africa and other places, they should really not be talking about the China model at all, other than, again, as a convenient device for autocrats. Really, they should be looking to the various experiments that go on in India every single day and look to those as a model for themselves, because they'll never have the discipline that China has. Otherwise, they would be China. As I said, it's in chapter 1 of this book, is people, power, and Generation Y. And that is that energy that we're seeing in Cairo, the energy that the government most certainly did not reckon with, and that it certainly felt would go away or could be crushed. And I say in this book, in that same first chapter, impatience has become a virtue. And that is a huge motivator. So I give a great amount of credence to that. And I think that these kinds of autonomous movements that quickly coalesce around a cause, and fueled by either the demonstration effect and the what happened in Tunisia and so forth, married with or accelerated by technology, social media, and so forth, is a very powerful force. And it's part of the reason why I believe that there can be such a thing as this bottom-up Generation Y psychology. So I not only I try to make it concrete and analyze it, which I don't think anyone else has done, but I also definitely celebrate it from a polemical standpoint. No? Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.